In my research group, we think about how the ocean traps and stores carbon. And one way to sort of introduce or think about this idea is that I think people are very familiar with the idea that forests on land trap and store carbon. So when you're walking through a forest and you can think of the big tall trees above your head, those trees themselves are removing carbon dioxide through photosynthesis. So the tree itself is trapping carbon, but also the layers of soils below the tree become this sort of long-term repository, like a big bank of carbon. And when we say long-term, we mean hundreds or thousands of years of carbon. Just think of all the leaves that, fall down into layers of the soil, and they're being sort of trapped there, like a carbon bank account. And it turns out that there are environments in the ocean that do the same thing.
Is climate changing? Yep. Is it changing for the better? Nope. Is there anything we could do? Damn straight there is. Our guest today is Tessa Hill, an oceanographer who specializes in climate change. She has some pretty hopeful news. Be prepared to be uplifted with a short side trip into misery. You live on kind of the front lines of a changing planet. There are people in this country who hear a message once in a while that climate change is a hoax, that there's no proof, that it's what have you. What have you seen with your own eyes, because you are on the front line, that would cement it for people? What proves it to you?
Well, what proves it to me is probably decades upon decades of scientific evidence. So I have seen it with my own eyes, but I also get to see it through, an amazing scientific process that we have around the world documenting evidence of climate change. But I specifically study the ocean. So let me just tell you maybe a couple of things that we've seen about the ocean very recently. One is that this summer, there has been a massive heat wave in the Pacific Ocean. It's a heat wave just like what we would experience on land. So just like here when we're oh gosh, this couple weeks of the summer was unbearably hot. Well, the ocean has been experiencing that too. And the heat wave started off the coast of Japan, and it contributed to the hottest summer that Japan has ever seen on record. And that heat wave sort of bubbled around in the North Pacific, and soon tendrils of that warm water were stretching all the way across the Pacific Ocean, literally thousands of miles across the Pacific Ocean. And about a month ago, we started seeing evidence of that warm water actually lapping up against the California coast. And what we see when heat waves like that happen are a variety of different things in terms of animals in the ocean, but we also see big economic losses because we as humans are connected to the ocean in a lot of different ways. But one of them is that we have a lot of businesses along the coast. We fish for recreation, or we fish commercially. The ocean really contributes significantly to our economy. And so when you have an event like this that really changes the whole ocean environment, what we see is that our economy is really impacted by that. And maybe I'll tell you one other little ocean story before we move on. One of the things that I work on is called ocean acidification. And this is a process where, as we put more carbon dioxide into the atmosphere through our human activities, the ocean actually sort of soaks up that carbon dioxide like a sponge. So about a third of the carbon dioxide that we put into the atmosphere goes straight into the ocean. And you could think about it as the ocean is doing us a big favor because it's absorbing a lot of the carbon that we're putting into the atmosphere through driving our cars, or maybe the food that we eat, or the industries on land. A lot of that carbon is just getting soaked up by the ocean. And it turns out that it's causing a pretty fundamental chemical change in the ocean. We call that ocean acidification. And my research group recently, over the last several years, has worked on trying to pull together all of the information that we have about ocean acidification on the west coast of the United States and put it kind of all in one place. So it was a little bit like solving a mystery, because we knew there was evidence in a lot of different places of this process, but all of the evidence had never been put together in one place, all out on one table. And we did that literally and figuratively and pulled together over 17 million data points on ocean acidification and climate change more broadly in the ocean. And it was an amazing process because we learned a lot about, just like what you said, like the evidence that we see for the chemistry of the ocean changing. But we also learned that in a lot of places along the coast, we're not monitoring well enough to even know what is happening. And so some of our most beloved places along the U.S. West Coast, including in California, where we have, parks and areas that are protected for biodiversity and, amazing ocean landscapes. In a lot of those places, we actually don't have enough equipment in the water to even monitor what is happening, which is a little bit scary.
So, and this isn't, but it's not a regional phenomenon. This is global, right? I seem to remember something about coral reefs being bleached as a result of acidification, and reefs are home to a fair, protecting of a fair amount of the fish that on the world, which a fair amount of the human population uses for its sole source of protein. So there are health implications in this as well. Like there will be starvation if we don't fix this or if we don't acknowledge it and move forward. Before I get off of the anthropic causes of this, is there any hint that this is cyclical or that this is just a part of a sweeping cycle?
Great question. And I love it when I get this question because I'm actually trained as basically a geologist / oceanographer. And so the work that I do actually spans very long time scales, sometimes, thousands or hundreds of thousands of years in the past, and then all the way up to what is happening today. And what we know with quite a lot of certainty is that what we're talking about in terms of human-caused climate change today absolutely cannot be attributed to a natural cycle. There are natural cycles, but we actually can separate the influence of natural cycles on the Earth's surface and what is happening with human-caused climate change. And the other thing is that how fast the change is happening today due to humans is unprecedented in the geologic record. So one of the things that I'm very interested in is looking at the past and saying, well, what can we learn from events in the past that might tell us about what's going to happen in the future? And one of the challenges with that is that when we think about things like temperature change and ocean acidification, it's very difficult to find time periods in the past that match the rate of change today.
That's sad. I need a beat. Sorry, ocean. But it's not, all right, so it's bad news if left untended, but you just got back from New York where you presented a paper on, oddly enough, methane.
That's right.
Can we talk a little bit about that? Because I found a little bit of hope in what you had to say about that.
Sure. So I was at New York Climate Week, and I was brought there as part of the Climate Crisis Advisory Group, which is an international panel of scientists and scholars that are working to make sure that science is informing policymaking and decision-making about climate change. And we were there at Climate Week to talk about a new report that came out of the advisory group about methane emissions. And the exciting thing about maybe thinking and acting on methane emissions is that methane is not in as high of concentrations as CO2 in the atmosphere. So oftentimes we don't even really talk about it when we talk about climate change. But it turns out that it's many times more powerful as a greenhouse gas. So it's in smaller concentrations, but it packs a big punch. And the other interesting thing about it is that it degrades in the atmosphere pretty fast. So what this means is that if we decreased our methane emissions, we being humans, and decrease the amount of methane we were adding to the atmosphere, we actually have the potential to impact the trajectory of climate warming pretty significantly and pretty fast. So while people may feel like we're sort of putting our foot on the accelerator of climate change, really putting our foot on the gas pedal, we talk about methane emissions as being like an emergency brake. And if we could make a big dent into human-caused methane emissions, that we actually could slow the progress of climate change, the process of climate change.
And so human-caused methane emissions, farming?
Yeah, so they come from sort of three sectors. One is from the energy industry, and I can tell you a little bit more about that. One is from agriculture, farming, and the final is from emissions that come out of landfills. So basically the way we handle waste. And at least in the United States, the majority of our emissions are coming out of the energy sector. It turns out that methane leaks quite a bit when we're extracting fossil fuels. And it's sort of considered a waste product of fossil fuel extraction, and there was never a lot of work put into trying to capture it. And simply by making that process more efficient and plugging leaks, we actually would deal with quite a bit of the methane emissions in the United States.
Or if we stopped mining for oil or whatever.
That is also an option, indeed. And as you mentioned, so agriculture contributes, and that mostly comes out of emissions from livestock itself, and then also rice paddies. And the interesting thing is there's a lot of innovations happening right now in agriculture around reducing methane emissions, both from livestock and from rice production. So I actually find that exciting and optimistic. And then that third sector is coming from how we handle waste. And maybe this is the one that's like in a nerdy way the most exciting for me, because when we at home, separate out our organic waste, like our waste from, food or from our gardening activities, and we don't put that into the landfill, but instead we compost at home or we use a city compost, we're actually removing the potential of those methane emissions. So this is something that individual people and communities and cities actually can make a big dent in that amount of methane that is coming out of a local landfill by just not allowing that organic material to go there in the first place.
So it would be almost a pretty easy, like low-hanging fruit in the equation to address this on, say, an infrastructural scale. So the bigger you can scale this up, it doesn't seem implausible to me that this could go citywide, county by county or whatever, so that there are broad sweeping implications for this, like just ways that we could do this smarter.
That's right. I think there are ways that we can do it smarter and equitably around the world. And I think part of what we're seeing is that countries around the world are setting targets for methane emissions. And, we need countries around the world to sort of, first of all, set aggressive targets, but also make a plan to meet them. But the other interesting thing in terms of sort of where science intersects this is that in the past, it was very difficult to track methane emissions. So we relied on individual industries or sectors to report what their methane emissions were. And it actually was sort of difficult to piece together a global methane budget. But now we actually have satellite technology that can measure methane emissions from space. And so we have really good tracking. And so what we need are for whether it's like a city or a local community or a state or a country to set a target around reducing methane emissions and then actually do the work to make sure we're tracking and accounting for those targets.
I've used to do some research, some, schmo research on climate change just to see what I could find out. And one of the things I've learned that blew me away was around the time of COVID, some of the satellites that you referenced detect nitrogen in the atmosphere. And within a day of COVID, well, I say within a week of COVID actually forcing everyone indoors and off the streets so that they weren't driving their cars, the levels of nitrogen emissions were down like to almost negligible. Mm-hmm. And the result of that was cleaner air, fewer respiratory diseases. Like they predicted, I think like China had something like 3,000 fewer deaths. The two maps I remember seeing were the Northeast United States and China. China's a big place, but someplace in China. And the difference between the before and the after was just, wow. That was a week of clearing stuff up. I'm imagining that methane You say it doesn't live as long in the atmosphere as carbon, but although it is much heavier, would probably, if we just stopped pumping, we'd see similar results to that, where it would clean up in a fairly short amount of time?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's the hope when we think about setting, goals around climate targets. I think one of the ways that we could meet these national and international climate targets is by addressing some of these, like you said, low-hanging fruit or small wins, because we know that, every slice that we shave off of climate warming matters. Every single tenth of a degree matters. And so one of the ways to think about this is that if we could aggressively address methane emissions, it gives us a little edge, a little time to then figure out how we're going to deal with maybe the bigger monster in the room, which is the carbon dioxide emissions.
And I want to point out here that the climate crisis group that you sit on, first of all, you are one of only 2 American citizens who are participating in that. Because of that, you have your finger on the pulse of the globe. Like, what are other countries doing as far as this goes? Are they embracing this desire to stop these emissions? Well,
yeah. I mean, I think that was one of the really inspiring things about being at New York Climate Week, was just the sense of international participation and collaboration in working towards these climate goals. And, countries are setting goals. They're probably not aggressive enough yet. And so I think that's part of our job is to keep encouraging policymakers internationally to address this situation as quickly as possible, for the exact reason that you brought up, which is that it directly intersects with human health, with our economy, with our environment, like so many different things that matter directly to us. But I would say, generally, the energy in the room at those meetings at Climate Week was that there are a lot of people working very, very hard on these problems and making progress. And I'm not sure that we hear enough in the media about progress that is being made. We tend to hear sort of the dark and gloomy stories and not the ways that people are partnering and working together and problem solving. And so that is definitely what I left with.
I'm going to touch on some other good news, because you talked about carbon, and carbon is kind of the devil that we have to kind of deal with. But some other parts of your research, actually, you have tapped into a very unique and powerful way of sequestering carbon, correct? Through the ocean, which was, when I read that, I was kind of like, it blew my mind, because I'd always thought of the ocean as a victim, through acidification and things like that. It's like, poor ocean that didn't ask for any of this, just happens to be, on the planet with us. But it turns out the ocean itself could help us.
Yes. Yeah, actually, I would say that was another thing that I walked away from out of Climate Week, is that we're probably not talking about the ocean enough, and the ways that the ocean can be helping in this challenge. So you're right. In my research group, we think about how the ocean traps and stores carbon. And one way to sort of introduce or think about this idea is that I think people are very familiar with the idea that forests on land trap and store carbon. So when you're walking through a forest, and you can think of the big tall trees above your head, those trees themselves are removing carbon dioxide through photosynthesis. So the tree itself is trapping carbon, but also the layers of soils below the tree become this sort of long-term repository, like a big bank of carbon. And when we say long-term, we mean hundreds or thousands of years of carbon. Just think of all the leaves that, fall down into layers of the soil, and they're being sort of trapped there, like a carbon bank account. And it turns out that there are environments in the ocean that do the same thing. So we call these blue carbon environments, and we usually think about that as seagrasses and mangroves and salt marshes. So these are all environments that exist sort of along the shore. And my research group in particular works on seagrass meadows. And so if you've never seen a seagrass meadow before, just imagine the lawn in front of your house, but it has adapted to live in the water. So there are big meadows of a plant that looks just like a grass that are living underwater. And just continue with the forest idea. the blades of grass are using photosynthesis. So they're actually taking CO2 from the seawater and it's being trapped in the plant itself, but also the layers of sediments below the grass. So just like the soils on land, like layers of soils or sediment underwater are also trapping tons and tons of carbon. And so we think about these as kind of the forests of the sea that are providing the same service in the ocean. And we've been doing a lot of work in our research group to try to account for how quickly those habitats store carbon, under what circumstances do they store carbon, and if we're trying to conserve or restore those habitats, are there things we can do to like sort of accelerate that carbon storage potential?
And stored carbon as an entity is a much different animal than stored methane, right? Methane is just going to be methane. Methane going to be methane. That's what it does. But what does carbon becomes? Rock becomes.
Well, it's actually, I mean, they're not, you could, this is a good question. It's a little complicated, but yeah. So the stored carbon, it can be in an organic or an inorganic form, for those of your listeners who think about chemistry a lot. And it gets sort of trapped there by layers of sediment. And if it's not exposed to processes like oxygen that would cause it to break down, it actually is stored there sort of for a long time, like hundreds or thousands of years. And so you can get layers and layers of sediments that have carbon, organic or inorganic carbon, trapped within them. And that carbon has then sort of been locked out of if you think about the carbon cycle of the planet, where there's a lot of carbon moving back and forth between the atmosphere and the ocean, that carbon has now been removed from that cycle, at least on short time scales. So we're actually taking it out of the atmosphere and kind of storing it in a box of the ocean. And it can come back out if we disturb those habitats. So if we have a big disease outbreak that kills off all the seagrass meadows, or if we have a construction project along the shore that harms the shoreline environment and the seagrass meadows disappear, that carbon is then unlocked and it is released back to the ocean and the atmosphere.
So it's like Ghostbusters. You have to capture the ghost and make sure that the switch is thrown, it's locked away.
It is like that. I'm using that from now on. It is like Ghostbusters.
Okay. Credit, please.
Yes.
And on the other side, well, I guess it's similar, but I know that I've seen in methane captured in the permafrost will eventually, if the permafrost melts, will explode and just burst back out into the atmosphere and do its thing, and will actually almost immediately change the environment in its locality. So that happens without disturbance. I mean, that's just things melting. But so what you're saying is capture the carbon, use seagrasses to capture the carbon, do not disturb the gravesite, lest we wake the beast or something like that. And how you say you're doing work right now on studies on how long it would take to do this part. What are you seeing?
Yeah, I mean, what we're seeing is that, so seagrasses are a protected environment in the state of California. And so there's a lot of work put into conserving them and even restoring them. There are groups that go out and actually plant the seagrasses to try to restore them in habitats where they used to be. And what we're seeing is that it probably takes a little bit of time, maybe a few years, before the seagrasses are sort of doing that job of, trapping the ghost and putting it in a box. So that's interesting. I mean, this is really a project that's kind of ongoing, but I think one of the things that's emerging from that is that it's not quite like a switch. We can't just like plant seagrass and have it work magic for us. We have to sort of protect and conserve these habitats, but also it means that the seagrass meadows we have left along the shore, we should protect them for many, many different reasons. They're really important as a habitat. They, provide a habitat for a lot of fish and invertebrates, but also they're like, basically doing this carbon work for us. And so we don't want any further degradation of that habitat. We don't want any harm to come to the seagrasses that have been established.
And you mentioned mangroves. I know mangroves are often used to stop like beach erosion and things like that. So it's like win-win. You can preserve the landmass and get rid of the carbon from the atmosphere. So let me just do, for those of you at home, a quick recounting of things that should give us hope.
Okay.
Methane is, if we try to minimize our methane release into the atmosphere, we could do a lot of good quickly, because it's I've heard like 80 times heavier than carbon or something like that. So that would help things. If we stopped producing carbon, if we went to more of like a green infrastructure, we were not really, releasing carbon into the atmosphere to tailpipes, et cetera, that would help get us where we need to do. And then to capture the atmosphere, or to capture the carbon that's actually been out there in the atmosphere, seagrasses could go a long way toward doing that. And it doesn't seem too terribly expensive. It doesn't seem too terribly complicated. It seems like the systems are kind of there already, and we're just not doing them because we lack the political will.
Oh, great question. I mean, that's certainly the case in some places in the United States. But I do want to point out that there's actually a lot of progress that is being made internationally, but also within the United States. Like you said, like cities, county governments, state governments. I mean, there are a lot of people who do have the political will to get these things done. I agree with your statement. So methane is sort of known as being up to 80 times more powerful than carbon dioxide on short time scales. And so, like we talked about earlier, if we could tackle that, it's like a fast win, a low hanging fruit. And, while we're sort of problem solving on how to do things like, bring the technologies that we have for green infrastructure, into everyone's home and everyone's cars and things like that, working with nature, rather than thinking about, humans versus nature or humans separate from nature, but thinking about how there are places on this planet that are actually helping us with this challenge, and thinking about how we protect them and work with these natural solutions, I think does bring me quite a bit of hope.
That's kind of cool. Hope is in short supply these days, so it's good to know that it's out there.
Yeah.
What can people do to help this whole thing along?
Yeah. I mean, I think one of the most important things that people can do is talk to other people about climate change. And then I would add, and the ocean, since I'm an oceanographer. I mean, one of the things we forget about is that there may be people right around us who are concerned about this, or they're curious about it, and maybe they want to do something to help and they're not sure what to do. And all it takes is maybe talking to your neighbor or your uncle or your church group or your city council or your school board and saying, hey, like, what are we doing to address this locally in our community? And oftentimes, that kind of work actually can bring a lot of hope too. So it becomes a little contagious, because when people start to feel like they're contributing to a solution, they're actually even more motivated to contribute more. And so I think, one of the most powerful things we can do is be, spokespeople for this planet, and talk to our neighbors and our friends and think about how we're going to engage in this in our everyday lives.
And so say I'm out there and I'm kind of on the fence. I'm not sure that I believe you. I'm not sure that I don't. What are some resources that I could go see this for myself?
Well, there's a lot of resources that provide data around climate change. So if people are interested in data around climate change, if they're moved by data, most states and countries at this point have national or state level reports on climate change. So there's quite a bit of information out there if you're driven by data. But I would also say, I kind of go back to my previous point, I would talk a little bit to the people around you. One of the interesting things that I've gotten to experience in the last year is that I had a book come out last year, which we haven't really talked about, but I'll just bring it up briefly. And because, that book is about the way that the ocean is changing, and fundamentally how it's changing our human relationship to the ocean. And that book has really opened a lot of doors for me to talk to a lot of people. And so I've been sort of, invited into libraries and people's living rooms and, government meetings and, local community organizations. And I always start by saying, tell me how you feel connected to the ocean. And people spill over with examples of how they feel connected to the ocean and also how it feels like things have changed. And so I guess to answer to your question is that there's an abundance of resources and data that we can, look up, and I could even post some for this session if you'd like. But I also think our own human lived experience is pretty important. And oftentimes you or the people around you have, lived experience of climate change.
Yeah, I don't know too many people who aren't pacified by the ocean, who aren't just like, like there's that you drive across country and I get to the beach and it's like, it's all better now. And there's something really healing about that, I think. And I'm sure that's not a mistake. Quick aside, I was doing some work on my own genealogy and I found my family history we're from Ireland. I'm like 99.9% Irish, literally, according to my DNA. But I located the place where my, seventh great grandfather was born in like 1625 or something like that, just north of Dublin. And I went into Google Earth and I went down onto the street and looked out at the ocean. And because his town was only like a quarter of a mile square. And I saw the ocean that he saw and I was like, I have to go here. So now I've got to go to Ireland. But there's just something even visually on a Google Earth thing, looking out and seeing that water is a really connecting thing. And it's nice to know that it's got my back, kind of a thing. If we plant seagrasses, it could be okay. Is there anything that we missed?
No, I think we talked about a lot of things, and I think there's reasons for hope. And I also think there's reasons for really hard work on these issues. And so I'm hoping people, hear both of those things and get to work with us.
Let me ask you this then. Last question. If you could wave a magic wand and see all the different changes that you think need to happen for us to have a very solid, clean future, what does that look like to you?
Oh, well, I think there would be a couple parts to my magic wand. One is around shifting energy infrastructure towards more sustainable sources of energy. And I think, that's a big societal shift that we're all undertaking together around the globe. But the technology is there. So I don't have to wave the magic wand to make the technology exist, because it actually exists. But if I could make it easier for people to adopt this pretty systematic change towards clean energy, I could certainly wave my wand that direction. I would wave a wand around reducing the number of people that are impacted by natural disasters every year. I think it's heartbreaking to watch. And every year that goes by that we don't act on climate change is a year that people will be harmed by it. And it's hard to know and hard to live through. And I guess I would circle back to what I said earlier. I would wave a magic wand and have people really deeply engage with their communities locally on these challenges together. It's because it's going to take a lot of working together and thinking about each other and thinking about lifting everybody up into a better place to get to the other side of this challenge.
And so you didn't actually say this, but I'm going to read into it and say, it sounds like maybe things are going to get a little worse before they could get better. Unfortunately, we're not on a trajectory yet where things are dramatically turning around, but I think we're sort of on the cusp of that. And so I think things will continue to get worse until we see countries and governments make really aggressive and assertive targets around emissions. But I think that, in our lifetimes, we're going to see this get better if we work on it together. Yep. I'm down with that. Thank you. Thank you. Because now I feel better. That's really what counts.
Good. It actually matters quite a lot.
Talk a little bit about the connection to the ocean, because it's something that I think that a lot of people, if you don't see the ocean every day, it kind of can slip your mind, but there is a very deep human connection.
There is. And it's one of the fun things about giving talks about the ocean sort of around the world, no matter who I'm speaking to, whether they live close to the ocean or very much inland, if I ask them, like I said, tell me what your connection is to the ocean, everybody has a story. Everyone feels some connection. And I think, there's a piece of that because it's sort of built into our DNA a little bit. So the history of sort of human evolution and human societies is deeply intertwined with the ocean. And for a very long time, there's been many, many examples of ways that we went to the ocean when we needed it. We needed it for food and for transport. If you just think about the history of humans on this planet, we sought the ocean at times when humans needed it. And I think that is represented around the world today because about 40% of the world's population relies on the ocean as a protein source. We're talking about 3 billion people. And so we literally rely on the ocean around this planet, and some more than others, and some think about the ocean as recreation or relaxation. But a lot of people think about the ocean as, small businesses and family-owned businesses and, shops along the seashore and food on our plate and, harvesting sustainable, healthy food for our families. And so I think the ocean means a lot of different things to people, but I think that connection motivates people to do something for it, which is one of the reasons why I like to remind people that they have that connection.
Yeah, there's so much lore around it too of trying to establish and maintain a relationship with the ocean, like everything from like sea shanties to you name it, like old poems and stories.
Sure.
It's a thing to be conquered. It's a thing to be feared. It's a thing to be respected. It's a thing to live in harmony with, kind of a thing.
All of those things. Yeah. Yes.
Well, thank you for the work that you do in that regard. Then.
Well, thank you so much. It's been great talking to you about it.
You too. Thanks. Come back and give us more good news later.
Okay, I'd love that.
All right. Perfect. Thanks. Sincerest thanks to today's guest, Tessa Hill. If you'd like to learn more about Tessa and her work, check out our YouTube page for links to her bio, books, articles, research, and more. And thank you for joining Minds Over Matters today. You can find us on YouTube, Spotify, and Apple Podcasts. Please subscribe, share with your friends, and spread the word. We have a lot to say. We guarantee something for everybody. Minds Over Matters is hosted by Ed Kiggins, produced by the College of Letters and Science at UC Davis, and filmed at the Y Pavilion. Thanks for listening. We'll see you next time.